It's very important that you understand the basics of lighting. Because if you don't understand the basics, you don't know how to use your gear efficiently. And so that's the problem that I see a lot of beginners getting started with lighting, is that they don't fully understand the fundamentals and the basics of it. So they just buy whatever's shown to them and they have no idea what to use, when to use it, and how to use it. So as we get into these basics, we're gonna cover all these things and you're gonna be amazed on the type of shots that you're gonna get. By the end of this, you'll have an understanding of the basics of lighting to be able to create some amazing photos. When it comes to lighting and creating great portrait light, size, the source of your lighting and the size of it really matters, okay? And I want to show you a little example of different sizes of light and how it affects the look on the model, right? So I have a fairly small light source here, and I'm going to turn this on, and I'm going to show you what it looks like lighting the subject. Now, of course you can get a great exposure. That's easy to do, especially when you're doing studio lighting, but the quality of light is important, okay? So now I'm gonna turn this off and I'm gonna use this larger light and you're gonna see the huge difference in how beautiful that light looks when that source is larger. Now, another thing, when you use a larger source, the shadows becomes less defined. And I wanted to show you a little example of that, of creating. So you can also create larger light by simply taking your light source and moving it closer to your subject. And so there's two factors that are involved. It's the actual size of the light source and also how close you are to your subject. The closer you come to your subject and the light source to your subject, the larger the light source becomes relative to the subject and it looks softer. Now I want to show you an example of some shadows that it creates, okay? So I have this whiteboard here and I'm going to turn this light on. And I'm going to show you as the light is farther away from the subject, the light source becomes smaller. And the smaller the light, the sharper the shadow. And as I bring this light in closer to the subject, the light source becomes larger. And look at the shadow, how it diffuses and the edges become less defined and creating soft light. As I mentioned before, the size of the light source matters, but also distance can create a larger source size. For example, if you would see these two different light sources, right? This is a 33-inch light source and this is a 16-inch light source. Most people would say, you know what, this 33-inch is going to be much better than the 16-inch. Not necessarily, because it depends on how far the light source is away from your subject. For example, if I were to move this light source closer, you can see that I can get it to equal the same size as the 33-inch. So this light source here, relative to this subject, is the same size as the 33-inch. So when you're creating and using your light, you want to get your light source as close as possible to the subject to make it larger. And so now I could take this 16-inch light source and create a beautiful photo just like the 33-inch by moving it closer to my subject. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. I'm going to show you how to make a 16-inch light source equal a 33-inch light source by just changing the distance to the subject. So if we bring up the 16-inch light source, I can measure that. It's about this big relative to where the subject is. And now if I go over to the 33 inch and measure that, it's about the same size. So I'm going to take a picture with this 16 inch and then I'm going to turn on the 33 inch and you're going to notice that it's very similar in quality. All right, so let's take a picture of beautiful Charlene. That looks awesome right there. Good, perfect. Now we're going to pull that away and I'm going to bring up my 33 inch and take a picture there and it relative. And so as you can see with the comparison of the photos, that even though that this is a smaller light source, we're creating a higher quality of light by moving that light source closer to the subject. I have to talk to you a little bit about the inverse square law. I know I didn't want to get math involved with this, but you do have to understand it because in regards to studio lighting, you need control of your lights, and that's really what it's about. And so what really the inverse square law is about is one, it can control the light on your background, okay? And so what you want to do when you're doing studio lighting is you want to independently control the brightness of the background and the brightness on your subject. So if I'm lighting my subject up and it's contaminating and that light is falling on my background, it's contaminating the light on that background. For example, if I wanted to gel that and color it, if this light is on my subject and also lighting up the background, it's going to dilute the color of the gel, and you don't want that. So you want it completely independent. So the inverse square law says is that the distance the light travels to your subject, so in this case, it's about 18 inches. And so I'm getting the perfect exposure with this light at 18 inches. What happens is that light is going to travel 18 inches behind my subject and then drastically get darker and fall off, okay? Now, if I pull my light further away from my subject, let's say right here, I'm about 6 feet away from my subject and I get the perfect exposure with this light on my subject. It's going to travel 6 feet to my subject and then also it's going to travel 6 feet and now it's going to hit my backdrop and light that up also. That may in fact create some shadows on your backdrop, which you might not want. And so therefore, I like to independently control my light. So the first thing is to move your subject as far away from the backdrop as possible. That will give you distance from the backdrop. Second, get that light as close as possible to your subject. So not only will you get soft light, but you will also control the light so the light will fall on your subject but not contaminate your backdrop. So you're completely controlled to the subject light and the backdrop light. Another thing is that whenever you half the distance of the light to your subject, you will gain 4 times as much power. And so therefore, when you get your light real close to your subject, not only is the light going to be softer, but you're going to use a lot less power, which, you know, in some situations is great. Usually the less power that you use, the better off it is, especially if you're on location and you're using battery power and so forth. That's going to be key into managing the amount of power that you have to make sure that you have enough light and power to last your entire setting. So that's another thing, is conserving power. So the inverse square law helps you, one, with the controlling of your light on the subject versus your background, and then 2, it actually controls the amount of power that you need to use on your equipment to light your subjects. Let me show you an example of this in a dark studio so you can understand this. Now the light is about 18 inches from my subject, okay? and look at the background and the brightness of it, okay? I am gonna pull back 10 feet now, and I'm gonna put the same exposure on her face, which is right about there, but look at the difference in the light. Now the light is traveling 10 feet to the subject and also traveling 10 feet behind her, lighting up the backdrop, okay? And so if you want to independent, and then also it can create a shadow too. See that nasty shadow? You don't want a shadow on your backdrop. So that's why it's very important to understand the inverse square law so you can control those shadows and the brightness of the backdrop.